Good day, duelists! Welcome to the second installment of Mr. Bazat's top 10 cards of each civilization. Last time we covered darkness cards, and this time around we are doing my own personal favorite civilization, Light. As a reminder, I am ranking cards based on their strength from a competitive standpoint, which means how many strong decks play this card, how important is it in said decks, and how well they represent their civilization, i.e. how much does this card make me want to add Light to my deck. Before starting out, let me quickly go through some honorable mentions that simply didn't make the cut. First of all, we have Juliana, Channeler of Suns. Excellent blocker, can't remove it with Comet Missiles or Spiral Gate, but 3 mana is sometimes too slow to stop rush decks, dies to things like Gaunt or Pig anyway, and it's also just a brick against control decks, which is why it recently got its nickname Brickiana. Secondly, Craze Valkyrie the Drastic, probably my very favorite card from when I was a kid. It's strong, there's a lot of initiates that you can evolve it on, and generally kills 2 things whenever it hits the board, but it's too slow against rush, it doesn't do enough against control, so it ultimately just hasn't found competitive success. Colon the Oracle, aka Poor Man's Aqua Surfer, it's a decent card, but in general there's better things you want to be using your deck slots for. And finally, one card that I really wanted to put on this list, it's Alcadias, Lord of Spirits. He's a big boy, he can win duels by himself, very iconic card, the cool factor is definitely there, and surprisingly enough it has also been the centerpiece of a tournament winning decklist, but the thing about said decklist is that it has only won a couple of tournaments back in 2022 and then basically never saw the light of day again. So while I do think that it's a strong deck, it's definitely more of a rogue strategy, and it turns out that there's just a lot of good light cards out there, so sadly this one just barely doesn't make the list. So to start things off, we have number 10, Magres, Vizier of Magnetism. It's Light's version of Aqua Halcus. It offers both tempo and card advantage when played. Aqua Halcus being such an iconic card in Duel Masters, it should come as no surprise that we see Magres on the list. It fits like a glove in any light-based deck that cares about tempo, but unfortunately most such decks, with one notable exception that we'll see later, have just never really been top tier, and it also doesn't necessarily represent what Light Civilization does. And it's also not a card that makes you want to run Light in your deck, it's just kind of a nice addition if you do. For those reasons I cannot put Magres any higher than number 10. At number 9 we have Paralysis, the Morning Guardian. This Guardian makes all your other creatures bigger during your opponent's turn, 2000 power bigger to be exact. This not only turns even your tiniest blockers into walls that make it very difficult for aggressive decks to break through, but also makes your entire board more resilient to fire mass removal. Just one of these guys will render cards like Burst Shot and Volcano Charger completely useless, and 2 of them will even nullify Blizzard of Spears. Because blockers care most about their power during your opponent's turn, Paralysis is usually played in blocker heavy decks, which I would say is part of Light Civilization's core identity, but unfortunately this also means that the amount of decks that this slots into is somewhat limited, which is why it's only at number 9. But the one deck where it is perhaps most important in, Lightwater Dark Hydro Hurricane, is one of the strongest decks at the moment, so Paralysis Morning Guardian definitely deserves a spot on this list. At number 8 we have Logic Cube. It's a 3 mana trigger that lets you search any spell in your deck and add it to your hand. Simple card, but this is a boon for light-based control decks. It allows you to search the perfect spell for any given situation, which is very oftentimes worth the 3 mana cost tax. The shield trigger ability is also relevant sometimes because, yeah, it doesn't directly stop your opponent's creature from attacking you, but oftentimes hitting into one of these still spells the end for the enemy, because you can fetch the perfect stabilizing spell from your deck like a Blizzard of Spears or something similar. It's played in many top tier decks, Fortress Burn plays it, Ruby deck outplays it, even Hydro Hurricane sometimes plays it. It's just an overall very solid card. It's also helped by the fact that many control decks in the meta are more than 40 cards in size, so running search spells is a welcome boost to consistency. Spell usage in general is a Light Civilization theme, so Logic Cube fits the picture, though it's usually not a reason to include Light into your deck, nor is it ever a centerpiece of any deck. It's just a nice little convenient tool that allows you easier access to your other tools. Number 7. Phobos, Sanctum Guardian Q. It's Logic Cube, but on a 4000 power creature. Of course it costs 6 mana, but the body is oftentimes worth it, especially since being a creature means it can interact with Soul Swap. It's also a survivor, which, even if you're not playing other survivors, means that summoning a second copy of Phobos will also trigger the effect of the first one, hence allowing you to search 2 spells with 1 summon. This card gave birth to the titular Light, Darkness, Fire, Nature Phobos control deck, which used to be the golden standard for control decks. And it's interesting because it's one of the few control decks that can afford to skip running water, because it turns out you don't need that much card draw when Phobos itself lets you fetch whatever cards you need from your deck. So it's obviously the centerpiece of Phobos control, and it's the main reason the deck exists in the first place, but it's not played in all that many other decks, which is why it's only at number 7. I was going to put it below even Logic Cube initially for that reason, but still I guess it sometimes sees play in Grave Survivors and in Light Dark Nature Control, and while these are niche decks, they have undoubtedly had competitive success. So I think number 7 is just about right for Phobos Sanctum Guardian. Number 6, Warlord Elzonius. So, Craze Valkyrie and Alcadias didn't make it, but one big boy Light Evolution did. He can't be targeted, he doesn't care about Terror Pit or Apocalypse Vice or Aqua Surf or Soul Swap, he just comes down and starts swinging. The thing is, you pretty much need to build your deck around it, which is why it sees play in only one deck, which is Light Water Elzonius, though other civilization combinations have been tried to varying degrees of success. The deck itself is very strong, but even so, why is it so far up the list, all the way up at number 6 if it's only played in one deck? Well, it's because more than any other example on this list, he not only makes the deck, he is the deck. He is so strong that he manages to push players to run cards that would never see play otherwise, like Sirion or even Bingole, just because they can evolve into this guy. Sure, Phobos is also the centerpiece of his own deck, but Phobos is a tool to get you to your stuff, while Elzonius is the stuff. So I think he deserves a slightly higher spot on the list, which is why he's sitting here at number 6. Number 5, Fal'iga Dawn Guardian. So we already looked at Phobos, who was a 6 mana 4000 that fetches you a spell from your deck. Now let's imagine that a lot of your spells are in your graveyard instead of your deck. Maybe it's late game and you've cast a lot of spells, who knows? Wouldn't it be great to have a Phobos that lets you fetches the spells from there, but also costs 1 less mana? Enter, of course, Fal'iga. This Guardian is just a late game value machine. Combine it with graveyard recursion like Morbid Medicine and all of a sudden you have a loop of unlimited card advantage. Even before you get to that point though, scenarios like facing Clamp on turn 4, followed by a Fal'iga on turn 5 taking the Clamp back, and you're like, well, I guess I won't have a hand anymore. There's also fetching Soul Swap with it and immediately swapping it for something in your mana zone, like maybe a Fortress Shell or something else. It's just, the possibilities are endless. Falsi is playing pretty much every control deck that runs Light, and recurring spells from the graveyard is a uniquely Light Civilization ability, so Falsi sits comfortably at number 5. The only reason why it's not higher is that there's just a lot of good cards in the Light Civilization. Number 4, we have Petrova, Channeler of Suns. This powerhouse of a creature lets you buff all creatures of one race of your choice by a massive 4000 power. Outside of very specific finishers, the vast majority of creatures played in the meta don't surpass 4000 power, so this essentially allows creatures of your chosen race to destroy anything else in battle. Not only that, but just like Paralaces from before, it provides creatures of the chosen race protection from fire removal spells, as not even Blizzard of Spears will be able to destroy them now. You obviously want to use Petrova in decks which runs many creatures of a single race, so speaking of Paralaces, for example in Hydro Hurricane you can buff Guardians, so now Para and Petrova are buffing and protecting each other. You might oftentimes find yourself running the Bronze Arm Tribe Skysword package, so you could choose Beastfolk for some extra power, you could run it in Elzonius deck since obviously you run many Gladiators, you can also run it in Survivors since Survivor is a race itself. There's even a very niche use case of choosing Soul Trooper while having Ikaz the Spydroid on board, and now you have a blocker that can block as many times as it wants and can't die to Comet Missile or Volcanic Arrows. So overall, Petrova is just a card that slots in nicely into so many decks, and oftentimes it has such a big impact when played that I just had to put it high up on this list. Number 3 is Holy Awe, one of the most iconic Light Civilization cards. It's a shield trigger that taps all enemy creatures. You can use this from your shields to stall for time, essentially almost always buying you an extra turn. You can use it to clear the opponent's board if you have stronger creatures, bypassing even untargetable effects like we saw on Azonius and Petrova, and it's just a very splashable card. People way back in the day were even splashing it in non-light decks just to have the utility of casting it from shields. That's how good the card is. But notice that on the last part I was talking in past tense, because well, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have put Holy Awe number 1, no questions asked. But I do feel like recently this card has not seen as much competitive play as before. I mean, Hydro Hurricane no longer runs it, Deckhout doesn't run it, I'm not even sure if it's correct to run it in Fortress Bird, and don't get me wrong, it's still an incredibly strong card. I mean, board-centric control decks like Forbos or Light Dark Nature run it, Survivors run it, Tempo decks also sometimes run it. It's just, I feel like the two cards above this one deserve the spots more. At number 2 we have Mistrias, Sonic Guardian, the 4th Guardian on this list if you've been keeping track, so almost half the list is just this one race. But anyway, Mistrias is just a card that can win games on its own. Yes, it's weak at only 2000 power, dies to pretty much any removal out there, but as easily as it can be removed, it also has to be removed. As soon as Mistrias hits the board, if it's left alive for even just one turn, it can generate just so much advantage. So when this is played, it forces your opponent to react like almost no other card in Duel Masters does. And sometimes they won't have an answer, and you just win, all off the back of this one card. I've even heard many people refer to the Rias engine, which as far as I can tell is just Rias, coupled with maybe cheap creatures I guess, but yeah, the card is so strong that it can make up an engine just by itself. It's a centerpiece in Hydro Hurricane decks, but it also sees play in Survivors, in the aforementioned Akadias deck, and even in some control decks like Light Dark Nature Control. It's just an overall very solid card that allows light decks to have access to tremendous draw power without having to rely on the Water Civilization. And because of the impact of this creature, I think Mistrias is well deserving of the number 2 spot. And finally at number 1, and this might be slightly controversial, it is Belix the Explorer. Now, I was very surprised to end up with Belix as my number 1 pick. I mean, we all know it's a good card, it's a cheap blocker that gives you access to spells from your mana zone, but is it really number 1 good? And well, the simple truth is that this little guy sees more play than any light card out there. I mean, pretty much every single deck I mentioned all throughout this video, some of them don't run Holy Awe, some of them don't run Mistrias, some of them don't run Petrova, but pretty much every single one runs Belix. Forbos Control runs it, Fortress Burn runs it, Survivor runs it, Ruby Deckhout runs it, Hydro Hurricane runs it, Azonius runs it since it's an Explorer, Light Dark Nature Control runs it. It's just every single control deck using Light, plus some others. When looking at just how much play this creature sees, plus how it perfectly combines two very representative traits for the Light Civilization, efficient blockers and spell manipulation, I was left with no other option than to put Belix the Explorer at number 1. So that's it for this top 10 video. Again, from 1 to 10 we have Belix, Mistrias, Holy Awe, Petrova, Fariga, Warlord Azonius, Forbos, Logicube, Paraolaces, and finally Magris, Vizier of Magnetism. What do you think? Do you agree with my picks? What did I miss? What did I put too high or too low? Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments, and if you haven't checked out the other Civilization top 10s, make sure to check out the playlist containing all of them, and until next time, take care.